The Shuar Indigenous peoples have battled hardships throughout their settlement in Ecuador. What began with the Spanish invasion in the 15th century to the recent Chinese mining exploration in 2016, the Shuar people have been exploited over and over again. Their story can be directly compared to the indigenous people of North America, with their tragic outcomes paralleling one another. Let's begin by understanding the historic culture of the Shuar people. It is important to know, appreciate, and respect the Shuar people by understanding their rich culture and their historical significance. The Shuar are a culturally rich indigenous people living near the tropical Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, specifically in the provinces of Pastaza, Marana Santiago, and Zamora Chimchepe. There are several groups within the Shuar people, such as the Achu and the Maraya, but for the purposes of this video, they will be collectively referred to as the Shuar Indigenous people. The Shuar people are semi-nomadic. The chief has very little official leadership, and Shuar is the official language. A typical household consists of a husband, his 2 wives, and all of his unmarried children. The males are tasked with hunting and weaving, while the women's jobs are tending to the garden and crops. When the males are about 8 years old, their male figurehead takes the boy on a 3 to 5 day journey where they drink only tobacco water. It is hoped that the boys experience a connection with the spirit world through visions. These visions make the boy invincible. One of the most unique traditions of the Shuar indigenous culture is their shrunken head war trophies. The shrinking head ceremony is sacred, and the Shuar people argue that these shrunken heads contain the spirit of the person. The embodied soul looks down upon his or her family and bequeaths good fortune upon the loved ones. Most importantly, the Shuar people deem the rainforest to be sacred. In fact, the Shuar people believe that they are the unofficial guardians of the rainforest. When the Spaniards arrived in Ecuador in the 15th century, the Shuar people welcomed the newcomers with open arms and introduced the Spaniards to their culture and their traditional way of life. The Spaniards wanted nothing to do with it. They saw the Shuar as a nomadic culture without distinct leadership, and, seeing a lack of leadership in the community, they took on the role and began to govern the Shuar people. In fact, they went so far as to impose a tax system which did not sit well with the Shuar people. They revolted, women warriors fighting with the men, and by 1599, the Spaniards retreated and left Ecuador. As the Spanish conquest was taking place around the world, the Roman Catholic Church was heavily involved in converting newly found indigenous peoples to Christianity. Ecuador was no different. The Catholic Church assumed the responsibility of purifying the indigenous people, and the Church was literally the only organization dealing with the education and care of the sick and elderly. The Church became the hierarchy of authority and gained considerable wealth while doing so. In 1905, the government started to limit the Church's authority. Education and health care became the responsibility of the government, and much of the wealth gained by the Church was seized. Mandatory tithes were abolished. In 1935, Catholic missionaries arrived and started preaching their Christian beliefs to the Shuar people. These same missionaries frowned upon the head-shrinking ritual and tried to discourage the Shuar people from continuing this practice. The overbearing Catholic doctrine led to the Shuar people organizing themselves in groups called centros. Catholic missionaries continually try to infiltrate these centros, but they are faced with resistance as the Shuar people defend their culture and beliefs to these non-indigenous colonizers. The Ecuadorian government saw the need to form official reserves, and one was formed in 1935 called the Shuar Reserve. It was agreed that the ancestral land rights of the Shuar people were guaranteed in the Ecuadorian constitution. By 1945, there was a definite separation between the state and the church, and freedom of religion was mandated. The 20th century has seen an influx of Catholic missionaries into the region. Their mission has been to progress the country of Ecuador with literacy campaigns targeted at the indigenous people. In 1964, a political group called the Federation was formed from representatives of the Centros. They were tasked with bringing the interests of the Shuar people to the forefront, and they met with government officials and large corporations. The talks were a success. In 1969, a deal was formed. The Federation of the government came to an agreement that the Federation would have total control over all administrative functions on the Shuar Reserve. Further, the Federation would be responsible for education and land titles and would promote modern marketing practices for financial advancement. Today, it is claimed that approximately 94% of Ecuadorians are Roman Catholic. What is not reported is that very few Indigenous people actually practice the Catholic faith. Fast forward to the 20th century, the discovery of oil, copper mining, and other valuable resources have been discovered in Ecuador and have gained interest and attention by the government and international companies. Ecuador became the first country in the world to identify the rights of nature and ecosystems in its constitution, spearheaded by President Rafael Correa. This came with swift backing by the Shuar people, who have, for years, been after the termination of the El Marauder project. The El Marauder project refers to a group of Chinese businessmen who have found great wealth and resources in the area and who have no problem exploiting the land, the people, or the resources for sheer profit. The Shuar people feel that this has caused irreversible damage in the region's ecosystem, but further, their mere presence violates the legal rights of Indigenous peoples to live, develop, and control their land and territory. A group of Shuar Indigenous people attempted to take over a mining corporation located in Morano, Santiago. The violent takeover attempt ceased within 24 hours, but the Shuar people still feel that the Chinese oil company is violating land rights. The Ecuadorian government has already conceded over 40,000 hectares of land to the ESCA, the Chinese mining company, for exploration over the next 25 years. If all goes well for ESCA, the copper riches could exceed over $1,200 million US in yearly profits. The Shuar people feel that they were not consulted about the mining exploration, and they were not informed that there would be forced evacuation of those living in the community, both of which are in violation of the Constitution. The struggle continues. The year is 2013. The NCI, Nature and Culture International, stepped in and worked with the Shuar Federation to identify and protect over 47,000 acres of rainforest in the province of Zamora Chinchepe. The agreement, called the Socio-Bosque Program, protects the rainforest until 2033. Along with the conservation of the rainforest, further benefits include the implementation of social welfare. This is the first time in the history of the Shuar people that they've been able to bargain in good faith and have been recognized financially in the conservation of their sacred rainforest. This agreement provides stability for the people living in the region and beyond, but more so, it provides an untouched link between the Podocarpus National Park and the El Condor mountain range. The government of Ecuador granted oil concessions in the rainforest in the 20th century. They took the same liberties with copper mining, lumber and pulp products, and agricultural crops. In the 1960s, the Shuar elders began to have visions of graves and foretold the destruction of their land and their cultural way of life. Corporate conglomerates moved into the area and inched their way through sacred ancestral land. The elders, along with the Shuar people, realized that their culture was in danger. Realizing the imminent threat from the imposing corporations, the Shuar people formed a coalition with various indigenous communities within the region so that their collective interests could be identified. One of the outcomes of the coalition was the realization that the Shuar people needed to immerse themselves in the modern world. The Pachamama Alliance was created. Their main belief is that all people on Earth should have a stake in the security of the rainforest. The mandate for the Pachamama Alliance is to establish and maintain stability through technological advancements and financial assistance for the Shuar people as well as those living in the region. The NCI is also working to improve healthcare and education for the Shuar people while preserving their strong, unique culture. The Shuar people have recently taken to the streets to protest the invasion of corporations in their sacred areas, and particularly to bring attention to the atrocities being made against the Constitution. In 2012, the Indigenous people started a public protest and were joined by anti-mining activists as well as students who vehemently opposed corporate influence in the region. They were protesting the scheduled mining exploration, which was to commence on their sacred tribal lands. The Chinese oil firm of Equatoriant had recently signed a contract with the Ecuadorian government, and the protesters wanted a public explanation as to the intent of the agreement. CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, is an organization that represents the rights of the indigenous people living in Ecuador. Humberto Cholongo, president of CONAI, felt the indigenous people were not getting a fair and equitable deal, and that the contract was heavily weighted in Ecuadorian favor. According to CONAI, the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, does not appear to be looking out for the best interests of the indigenous people. Correa disagrees and is quick to point out that the significant profit-sharing deal with Ecuador, seeing over $4.5 million in the next 25 years. The Shuar tribe would reap 10% of that figure. The Shuar people are quick to point out that their opposition is not purely about the money. This deal would disrupt their culture and their way of life. Further, the Shuar spokespeople say that their spiritual customs, which are so closely tied with the rainforest, would be extremely disrupted. The rights of the Ecuadorian people through their constitution are supported by the United Nations, which has determined that only the indigenous people of Ecuador have final say over the land and resources, and that the government must consult with the indigenous people before engaging in activity that would disrupt the land. How then does the government and the conglomerates continue to circumvent this declaration? My investigation of the Shuar indigenous people of Ecuador brought to light the personal attacks bestowed upon them by the Spaniards who tried to colonize them, the international corporations who exploited them, and their own government who has taken the side of wealth over culture and preservation of the rainforest. I found many similarities between the treatment of the Shuar people and the North American indigenous people. Colonization, cultural beliefs, mistreatment by government and large companies, interference by the Catholic Church, creation of reservations, protests, and the continual exploitation of the indigenous people is still happening today. It is hard to deny that the indigenous people have been victimized and oppressed around the world since being colonized. Their rights and freedoms have been diminished. The government has taken charge and expected the indigenous people to sit back and take it. In the spirit of change, what have we really accomplished? Have the colonizers truly benefited the indigenous people by their colonization? I'll let you be the judge.